Last Thanksgiving, my boyfriend and I loaded our 2-month-old daughter into our car and drove from Miami to Naples to visit my family. Being new parents, we were extremely nervous about taking such a lengthy trip with the baby and packed for every possible scenario. We left shortly after 12, my boyfriend behind the wheel, and we hit the highway, which was swollen with holiday traffic. After about an hour of driving, the baby became fussy, and we pulled over at a rest stop to feed her and change her diaper. While I was changing her, my boyfriend stood outside the car stretching, and suddenly called my name. Peering outside the car, I looked across the street in the direction he was pointing. There was a clown with a purple star painted over his face, and wild, crazy, unkempt black hair, and a purple and white checkered outfit standing on the opposite side of the parking lot, just waving to people as they pulled in and out of the rest stop. I chuckled and returned to what I was doing, unbothered by the clown, figuring it was just part of some kind of promotion. As we pulled out of the station, the clown waved at us, and I gave a lazy acknowledgement back. Just before my boyfriend took his foot off the brake and eased into traffic, the clown gave me the most hungry, sinister smile I had ever seen, and shouted,
"You would look amazing draped over my lap."
Even through the closed car window, I heard him clearly, and said, "Wow, what a creep." As we drove away, I repeated what the clown had said to my boyfriend, who hadn't quite heard it, and for a few minutes he was dead set on turning around to confront him. But I told him it wasn't worth it, as we still had a long drive ahead of us. We arrived in Naples shortly after 2:30, and by then, I had already forgotten about the incident and didn't even bring it up to my parents. We had a great time at my parents' place, and ended up leaving close to 11:30 at night, much later than we had intended to. My parents tried to convince us to stay, and while we had plenty of stuff for the baby, we hadn't packed any overnight things for ourselves. So we decided just to commit to the drive. We figured that there would be a lot less traffic, and it would take a shorter amount of time to get home. My boyfriend had been driving for about 45 minutes when he asked me if I wouldn't mind taking over, as he was having a hard time keeping his eyes focused. I told him to pull over at the next rest area, and I would take the wheel. After a few minutes, we see a sign for a rest area and pull into it. It wasn't the same rest stop as before. It had no bathrooms, vending machines, or anything. It was basically just a long parking lot, with one row of parking spaces which looped back onto the road. My boyfriend pulled the car into a spot, nose first, so it was facing a long chain link fence, and beyond it, there was just trees and a swamp. I couldn't see anything specific in the glow of the headlights. He put the car in park and left the engine running, and the lights on as he climbed out of the driver's seat. The baby started to fuss as soon as the car stopped moving, and after I climbed out of the passenger seat, I opened the back door to check on her. My boyfriend climbed into the passenger seat and immediately shut his eyes. After I confirmed that the baby was fine and would probably fall back asleep when we started driving again, I shut the back door and made my way to the driver's seat. That's when I heard the sound of the chain link fence rattling, and something being dragged across the metal links, steadily drawing closer. I turned in the direction of the noise, and for a split second, I only noticed the dark outline of a figure on the opposite side of the fence, until they stepped into the light of our headlights. It was the exact same clown from the other rest stop, except this time he had a large red stain splattered across his purple and white costume, and was dragging a broken beer bottle across the fence. He pressed his face directly in the fence and smiled at me. He cackled,
"Hello again,"
and started making lewd gestures with his tongue. I was at a loss for words. It was so unbelievably surreal that I could only stare at him in disbelief and horror, not knowing whether I should be truly afraid or start laughing at the absurdity of it. My boyfriend launched himself out of the passenger seat and screamed, "Get in the car!" When he opened his car door, the baby started crying out, and the sound could be heard across the silent parking lot, and the clown immediately started singing in a grotesque, uneven voice.
"Rock-a-bye baby in the treetop. When the clown comes, the cradle will rock."
My parents had given us a set of fancy glasses for our dining room table. My boyfriend launched one directly at the clown. The glass shattered against the chain link fence, and sprayed tiny razor projectiles all over. The clown hissed and immediately booked it to the end of the fence. My boyfriend and I jumped into the car, slammed the doors, and locked them. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the spot, and as we put the car in drive, we saw the clown charging towards us across the parking lot. My boyfriend yelled at me to hit him, but I swerved to avoid him and floored it out of the lot and back onto the highway. For the next several minutes, my heart was racing, convinced that at any moment a speeding car would come up behind us and try to run us off the road, but fortunately that never happened. We were so shaken and traumatized that all we could do for the rest of the way home was ask each other over and over again what the heck just happened. We could only speculate what the guy was doing out there at 12 a.m., dressed like a clown in the middle of the Everglades on Thanksgiving night. We considered that he was just trying to mess with people, but you would need some serious balls to pull that kind of stunt out there in the Everglades. The people that live around there don't put up with that kind of nonsense. And what was he even doing there? Just hiding behind the dark fence for a completely random car to show up so he could traumatize them? I don't know if the stain on his suit was actually blood, but he made us feel threatened enough that we felt justified throwing something at him. And seeing as how his response was to charge us, I suspect that his intentions were hostile. The fact that we had seen him earlier that day made the situation even worse, because it felt like he was stalking us. My boyfriend had a license to carry a gun, so all I can say is, it's a good thing that he wasn't packing that particular night. This Thanksgiving, we plan to stay home. I know when most people think of a female clown, they immediately think of the charismatic and very sexy Batman villain Harley Quinn, but I promise they're not all like that. Back in 2012, I was walking home one night at around 9. I live in Gilbert, Arizona, and was walking by a large, wide-open park with a couple of soccer fields and basketball courts when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The overhead lights were still on and illuminating the fields, and I noticed someone sitting cross-legged out on the grass. I pulled out my earbuds and stepped off the sidewalk to get a closer look. At first, I thought maybe it was someone who had hurt themselves, but as I took a few steps closer, I noticed that it was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, leaning forward over something. It was hard to tell her exact age because her face was covered in white makeup, and a red heart and a black spade painted on her cheeks. Her top lip was painted black, and her bottom lip dark red. She was wearing a gray hoodie with the hood up, but had 2 holes cut on either side to accommodate her blonde pigtails. I stopped in my tracks and glanced around, convinced that this was a YouTube prank or something. But we were in the middle of a wide open area, and aside from the occasional car passing by, we seemed completely alone. The clown lady was wearing bright red sneakers, torn jeans, and some kind of clawed glove on her right hand like Freddy Krueger. I was only a dozen feet or so away, close enough to say something, but I decided to back away slowly and not engage in whatever she was doing. As I took a step back, she called out to me without looking up.
"Where are you going? Come here!"
"Nah, I'm good," I replied and continued to walk away. For the first time she looked up and smiled way too big, showcasing far more teeth and gums than was necessary. She raised the clawed hand, and I noticed that at the ends of each fingertip was a sharp point, like a thumbtack.
"You sure? More for me then."
That's when she pulled out a large kitchen knife, the size of an ear of corn, and started cutting into the thing on the ground. I glanced back down and noticed the thing that she was leaning over appeared to be a dead bird of some kind, and she was using her clawed hand to pull the feathers off. She stabbed at the bird with the blade, and then pulled out a flask out of her pocket and threw back a swig. I nearly fell backwards into the road as I maneuvered myself off the grass and onto the sidewalk. I didn't want to turn my back on her the whole time, convinced that it was a prank, and I should start looking around in every direction for someone with a camera or a phone. But there was no one else even remotely close by, and no place they could be hiding either. I quickly turned around and power walked down the sidewalk towards my apartment complex. As I reached the intersection, I was forced to wait for the traffic light to change so I could cross safely. My earbuds were back in, but I honestly wasn't listening to the music. I was so confused and unnerved by what I had just seen. I glanced over my shoulder and saw to my horror that the lady clown was walking up the sidewalk towards me, appearing to be looking directly at me. I wrenched out my earbuds again, glanced both ways, up and down the street, and even though the light was still green and the cars had the right-of-way, I sprinted across. When I reached the other side, I turned and saw that she was still approaching the intersection. She waved at me with her clawed hand, and a few feathers fluttered to the ground. She called out to me.
Don't get killed tonight.
At least I'm pretty sure that's what she said. There were sounds of traffic muffling her voice. I literally ran home, entered my gated apartment complex, and went the long way around the building just to make sure I wasn't being followed. I then climbed up the stairs, locked both of my locks, and stared out my peephole in a panic. For about 5 minutes before I finally calmed down, I didn't turn on any lights in the apartment, and instead used my phone to navigate to my bedroom, and then used a light from my laptop screen to change and go to bed. The following day, when the sun was high in the sky, I double-checked the spot where the clown lady had been, and the mutilated remains of a bird were lying on the grass. A few weeks later, I saw her again in broad daylight. I was driving my friend's car and noticed her walking down the sidewalk in full makeup in the exact same hoodie, dragging a garbage bag behind her. I turned the car around out of morbid curiosity and followed her for about a half-mile, pulling over on the side of the road to let her walk ahead for a while and slowly continuing on. When she reached a wide-open plot of dirt, I saw her pull out what looked like to be a dead rat from the garbage bag. She cut it open with a switchblade and wrung it out like a sponge, blood spilling onto the ground, and probably all over her clothes as well. That's when she turned towards me, and with blood running down her fingers, raised her right hand and put her thumb between her index finger and middle finger. This is known as giving someone the fig, and if anything, it's even more obscene than raising your middle finger. I immediately backed the car up and got the hell out of there. It's not that when she turned towards me that bothered me. She easily could have realized that she was being followed. It was the gesture she gave me. It's one I commonly use at people in traffic, and I always get a kick out of it because hardly anyone knows what that means. But I've never seen anyone else use it in my life, and the fact that she did really shook me. I mean, what are the chances she knew that I would understand it? I've since moved, but my buddy still lives out there, and occasionally tells me he spots her wandering the side of the road. So next time you're in Gilbert, keep an eye out.